All right. Welcome everybody to our bi-weekly CD lectures. I'm Casper Lam, the director of the BFA CD program. Today we have Nico Chilla, who is a BAFA philosophy CD junior in our program and also a CD tutor. And he will be starting off our CD lecture today by showing his work, and it will be followed by a presentation from Andrew Shurtz. So Nico, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Let me share my screen. Okay, so the project I'm sharing is a project I did in my core topics editorial design class last semester with Juliet Cesar. And so it's a design of this text, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which is a philosophy text by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And what you're looking at right now is not my design. It's a screenshot from the PDF of this text that I was actually reading during the same semester in a philosophy class. And you can start to see that this text has this really unique structure. So it has these numbered sections, which are called propositions, and the propositions will comment on one another. So for example, 1.11 is a comment on 1.1. And so it's this layered hierarchy that it goes two layers deep here, but throughout the full text, it gets up to 6 layers deep. So it's very intricate. And the problem is that I was reading this text in my philosophy class, and there was no differentiation of this hierarchy. So you can see it's just this flat numbering system. And that was difficult for me to follow the structure and sort of know my relative location within the text and what was commenting on what. So the premise for this project was sort of experimenting with different visual presentations and reading experiences for this single text. And this is just the header that goes across each one of those experiments and lets you navigate between them. But so the first experiment I did, the first thing I did was just indent these propositions. So I'm pulling, it's called thread, and you can guess where that's pulling from. It's pulling from like online forums. So like Reddit, for example, that's really the inspiration here. And it's just taking that from an interaction design context into an editorial design context of just showing you these layers of hierarchy in this really unique text. And then the other thing I want to note here is a settings bar, which also goes across each one of the experiments. And it does a couple things. So one thing it lets you do is switch between the original German and the English translation. And the reason for that is just, it's something that I know that my professors would appreciate. I don't speak German, but they do, and they like to compare how certain words within the text are translated. So the purpose of this switch is just to let them do that and go back and forth. And then the settings bar just also has a search that lets you search for propositions, which you'll see right there. So this is the second experiment. It's called tabs. You can also sort of guess where it's pulling from. So it's files, it's sort of pulling from file systems and being able to navigate between different depths of the text. And the only thing I want to point out in this one thing that happens in all of the experiments is there's these little gray areas. I don't know if you can see that. Hopefully you can see that. But so another challenge with this text is it has a lot of logical notation, a lot of equations and mathematics. And I was thinking about ways that I could annotate that to make it clear to a reader and make it easier to follow through the text. So I'm borrowing from another interaction design format. If you're familiar with Markdown and code blocks, that's where I'm taking inspiration from, of just having the logical notation highlighted so you can see these different variables as you're moving through it. So then after I made those two experiments, I was looking at how other researchers have taken this text and visualized it. So this really gives you an idea of how detailed this hierarchy is, of just like, it's a tree structure of just layers of propositions on propositions and propositions. And I was thinking about like how this could possibly be integrated into the text. And the way that I did that was just by having this sort of side-by-side format. And this I sort of call a context map. And what I mean by that is that as you're scrolling through, navigating between these propositions, it shows you your relative position within the overall text. And it also lets you navigate between them like that. So yeah, that's this one. And then last but not least, this one is called nonsense. And so here I'm going to talk a little bit about the content of the text I haven't really talked about. I'm not going to try to explain it in full because that would be impossible. But one thing that I want to mention about this text, one of the themes is that he's talking about how other philosophers make these sort of big ostentatious claims and make claims that sort of sound meaningful. But he's saying that if you really look at the language of those claims, then they're neither true or false. They're just complete nonsense. So he's calling out a bunch of philosophers for being completely nonsensical. And then the irony is that in the second to last proposition of this text, he sort of admits that anyone who's read his own text correctly knows that by his own standards, everything that he has said in this text is complete nonsense. So it's just a way of visualizing that. And I think that the overarching thing that I learned in this project is that although like formats like this really interesting to experiment in, and I think it's worth experimenting in these formats, and certain things like the navigation I find really useful. Personally, for my own reading experience, what I ended up gravitating towards the most was really just this, because it inhibits me the least, it gets in my way the least, and it shows me what I need to know. This is sort of extra information that may not be useful to me while I'm reading, but this just sort of clearly lets me know where I am and lets me navigate. Yeah, I think that's all I got. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Nico. It's really great to see how you're bringing together your two majors together in this project. So that's fascinating. So thank you for sharing with all of us. I want to take this time to introduce Andrew. Andrew Shurtz is a graphic designer, educator, and researcher based in New York City. He is co-founder of the international design collective We Have Photoshop. He also co-founded Convolution, a conceptual journal dedicated to exploring the intersections of experimental criticism, poetry, art, and typography. He has taught design at Parsons since 2011 and currently teaches typography, book design, experimental publishing, and contemporary graphic design theory. And he has previously taught at Rutgers and City College of New York and served as a visiting critic at Yale, NYU ITP, and University of Connecticut. He is the recipient of 10 AAUP awards for book design and the Yale School of Arts Phelps Burden Award. He received his BA from Louisiana State University and his MFA from Yale. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Casper. Let me share my screen. It's always the most exciting part. All right. Hi, folks. I'm Andrew. Thanks for everyone who's decided to sit in today, and an extra special thanks to all the CD students who are required to listen to me. Right now, I'm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana with my wife and son. We're staying at my parents' house. We've been here for a few months. I'm actually in my old bedroom. You might notice the Garfield posters. It's not a current obsession, but it's still a part of me. So being in Louisiana, perhaps I should say, instead of hi folks, hey y'all. I'm going to use my time today to talk a little bit about my work or my practice or whatever you want to call it, but also some of the ideas that shape whatever it is that I do, because those ideas are also a part of what I do when you really think about it. And given the current state of things and what we've all been through in the last year and how much our shared sense of home and comfort have been challenged, and also how it's such a lovely Friday afternoon, I thought it would be nice to talk about some of the things that have kept me a little grounded. So I'm going to be looking at 3 of my favorite desktop backgrounds. That's my real title. These are all images that I've used on my desktop at various points in the past. This first is an image of Elizabeth Koenig, an artist who worked in New York in the early 1900s. This right here is a picture of a blank backdrop at the Sears Portrait Studio commissioned by Jeff Hahn. And then this is a photo of the Real Superstore, a minimalist, maximalist supermarket that was open in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in the mid-1980s. And while I talk about these 3, I'm going to make 3 rough attempts, emphasis on the rough, to imagine a post-form future for communication design. That's the actual title. So the first one. This is Elizabeth Koenig, also with Romaine Benjamin in front of the Treasure Box store, Sheridan Square, Greenwich Village, New York, photo by Jessie Tarbox Beale. She was a great photographer, and this was in 1916, probably. In the photo, so Elizabeth was an artist and an illustrator, and this is her in front of her studio. That's her studio on the left. On the right is Romaine. He's the proprietor of this place called the Treasure Box, which was this like semi-legendary, artsy, hip antiques and other goods store And they basically just look really cool. I love this photo because it makes me think about how people worked in the past and also how those ways are similar to ours now. Some of the details might change. This old stable is now the location of a high-rise apartment building, but the ideas of artists and creative workers scraping by in tiny spaces still holds true. I also find this image intriguing because it helps me imagine how communication design might begin to see its own history beyond purely visual form. Elizabeth filled out this questionnaire in 1913. This was sent out by a committee working to create a group called the Vocational League for Art Workers. Their aim was to help women artists find employment in the creative industries. Zoom in. In the questionnaire, Elizabeth lists her education history, Pratt and the Art Students League, and describes how she got her first paid art-related work recommended by a friend. I should note that the word designer that she uses here is not exactly the way that we would use it now. Back then, this is before the term graphic designer existed. And so her working as a designer would usually mean working in terms of making like visual patterns or prints for textiles or fashion or something like that. At the bottom, there's a great detail where she shows her reasons for wanting a vocational league. Okay. The trouble now is that the beginner does not know where to go or who to see if she does. Often seeing the wrong man at a concern would lead nowhere, while the right one might mean work. If one does not know the name of the right man to see, the office boy will be sure to send them to the wrong one. So note her gendered response. She's writing from the perspective of a woman wanting to find work, but subject to the whims and mercies of an endless procession of men. The committee for the Vocational League sent out hundreds of questionnaires to women artists all over the city. A handful of the responses survive. They're a fascinating snapshot of how women were educated in the arts and found work in the first part of the century. This is Helen Sargent Hitchcock, the main organizer behind the Vocational League. Helen worked to aid women in the arts for years and founded multiple organizations to do so. When the League was finally founded, its name became the Art Alliance of America, and its mission was expanded to include both men and women. The goal was the same, helping artists find work in the creative industries. This was a time before a single field of graphic design existed. Instead, there were artists, illustrators, typographers, photographers, and printers. An artist like Elizabeth didn't work in the same way as we do now, but she may have sold drawings to an art director or say worked with a fashion company creating designs for fabric. What we now think of as a single industry was divided into multiple smaller ones with lots of overlap and misdirected energies. Helen wanted to fix that too. Helen was the main organizer behind a group called the Arts Center, a group that unified a number of creative groups under a single umbrella. Before the Arts Center opened in 1921, these groups all worked independently. Helen had a vision of each group working cooperatively with the unified goal, improving the connections between art and industry in the United States, exposing printers, publishers, and manufacturers to a wide range of creative workers and helping those workers find work within their fields. This invitation was for a planning meeting for all of the proposed societies to work together. The message, all for one and one for all, is absolutely infectious. Helen, with the help of a large group of society women, was able to secure funding for a shared building that opened in October 1921 on East 56th Street. More importantly, she was able to get seven separate groups to cooperate together for a single goal. The Art Alliance of America, which we talked about, the American Institute of Graphic Art, which at the time was mainly concerned itself with fine printing and typography, the Art Directors Club for men who commissioned artwork for publication and was basically created at the start of the Art Center, the Society of Illustrators for commercial illustration, the Pictorial Photographers of America for modern photography, especially for advertising, and the New York Society of Craftsmen and a club called the Stowaways. Helen was driven by what she saw as wasted energy from the duplicated efforts of New York's innumerable art societies. Why not bring together all these various associations where they could share expenses, experience, and resources and combine energies to create in America a background of decorative art reflective of its mode of life and to form an art spirit and an art appreciation which should extend to all the people. Helen's organization, the Art Center, marks the transition from individual separate fields to a single collective one and marks the beginning of the modern design industry in North America. Many of these groups worked alongside each other before, but by sharing their efforts collectively, they were able to expand and develop in much bigger ways. Each society had space in the Arts Center. They had shared galleries, individual meeting rooms, and all of these allowed each other to rub shoulders with each other and create new, exciting influences. A designer like Frederick Gowdy, one-time president of the AIGA, he's the white guy in the back, could encounter the personal work of Margaret Watkins, a member of the Pictorial Photographers and a pioneer of modern advertising photography, or the work of Grace Drayton, creator of the Campbell Soup Kids and a member of the Society of Illustrators. But back to Elizabeth. I don't know if she participated in the Arts Center, but how would she have been accepted there? If we actually zoom into her photo, we can see a poster for a suffrage ball for the 1916 presidential election. We know where she stood on the issue. Of the groups in the Arts Center, the Society of Illustrators, the Pictorial Photographers, and the Art Alliance were all progressive groups that included women from their inception, and all included people who worked in what we now know as the graphic arts. As we can see from this meeting invite, she wouldn't have been able to be a member of the AIGA. Members are urged to be present and bring their friends. Ladies are invited. This was in 1922. The AIGA dragged its feet and didn't allow women members until 1925. It's clear from this statement that the decision was done under pressure. At a special directors meeting held recently, it was noted that the sense of the meeting that women as well as men may be admitted to a membership in the Institute. If this were a newspaper, this big news would merit a 3-column head, for though the vote has not settled the matter, this moot question has bothered many a board meeting. But what will come of the chivalrous action, it is hard to say. This was published, by the way, in the Arts Center Bulletin, which was like their main newsletter that went out to like all over the United States. So it's a really broad reach. Now, part of my point here is how design sees itself and its history only through images and form. If you wanted to read about AIGA's own history on its own website right now, you'd have a difficult time. I've searched and can't seem to find any direct link to anything in particular. However, if you do type history in the search bar, you'll get an old link. This is the AIGA timeline prepared in 2014 that incorrectly lists 1920 as the date that the AIGA accepted women. It also claims that AIGA was the first graphic arts organization to include women designers, which is at best a stretch. But anyway, back to Helen. By founding the Arts Center, Helen exposed a conservative, stuffy group of people and ideas that they might not have to people and ideas that they might not have encountered otherwise. Her work pushed the AIGA forward and forced it to confront a future that wasn't just men sitting around discussing their typefaces. The funding, support, and broad reach of the Arts Center allowed the AIGA to become a truly national organization instead of simply a New York-based club. They were able to fund touring exhibitions like the 50 Books of the Year and an annual Medal of Achievement thanks to support from the Arts Center, push for and enact the first national standards for process colors, and the Arts Center even helped keep the AIGA afloat during the Great Depression. It's not a stretch to say that the AIGA owes its very existence to the Arts Center and Helen's work. So what does this all mean? Design history is told through images, but this is a story about how a group is organized and how a group of women work together to improve their institutions and create change. This is also a story of how we see the history of design. Because we think of form as the end result of our work, we tend to devalue anything that doesn't look exciting. I'm not trying to claim that AIGA has intentionally erased Helen's work, but stories like this get told less frequently in graphic design than ones centering around formal graphic imagery. It's easy to discount a story like this because the images aren't as obvious and don't fit into the standard narrative where a primordial design prehistory was rushed into modernity by the Bauhaus. This, to me, feels more modern. And in the end, design is about people, not pictures. So my second background. This is by Jeff On. This one I love because it helped me see a way to create something unexpected. I've known Jeff for a number of years, and he's possibly one of the most uncompromising designers I know. He also teaches here at Parsons. These photos are of blank backdrops at the Sears Portrait Studio. Jeff had the Sears photographer zoom the camera out as far as possible and take series of photos of their various backdrops without any people, just a single object. It's really simple. My studio, we have Photoshop, used these for the cover of the latest issue of Convolution, a journal we've co-edited and designed for a number of years. Convolution is dedicated to exploring the overlaps between language, art, and visual form. We'd like to ask the questions: at what point does a text become an image? At what point does an image become text? There's 4 of us and we have Photoshop. We all met in grad school. There's Mike Gallagher, he's in London, Rebecca Jimenez in Chicago, Sebastian Campos in Moscow, and me, I'm in Brooklyn, although technically I'm in Baton Rouge right now, but you get the idea. We thought it would be nice to find a way to work together and still stay friends. We make things sometimes. If you zoom in on this poster we made, and you can see a group photo. We're in the bottom right corner, having a nice group hug. This is a good moment. So for Convolution, it's one of our longest running and most rewarding projects. It's an opportunity to make work for a wider audience that still follows our own internal logic. We use our own typefaces almost exclusively. Mike makes them, and we try to change things up each issue so no 2 look the same. In the first issue, we set up a ridiculous grid with margin footnotes and titles in the gutter. In the second issue, we expanded things with multiple books, inserts, and a poster. Here's a great contribution by our patron saint, Robert Grenier, who's developed his own way of drawing poems that aren't writing and aren't pictures. And here's Hello Kitty. For the third issue, we made the journal bigger, but kept the images small. Lots of negative space. For the fourth issue, we went red all over and got to work with some other nice stuff, like Jean-Luc Guittard title cards, a new English translation of an illustrated essay by Renee Magritte, and an amazing poem by Juliana Huxtable. We kept it in Arial because it didn't feel right in our own typefaces. The fifth issue has some great stuff also. A collection of wiki contents by Laurel Schwulst, an interview with Martine Sims, an essay on a typeface by Roman Gornitsky, an interview with Morgan Parker, some Commodore 64 art by Nick Montfort, and found poems by Natalie Czech. Most of it's typeset in Mike's new font. He made his own version of Jansen, which I think is really great. For the cover, we wanted to make something that broke away from the minimal vibe of the last 2 issues. Sebastian wanted to use these photos of Jeff's. I love the idea, but was stumped about how to go about it. Everything I tried wound up feeling forced. I also really wanted to make something where all 4 of us could contribute somehow, but where no one would have absolute ownership over the final result. I decided to use Seb's suggestion to use Jeff's photos as an instruction and ask the others for instructions without telling them what the others told me. I then have to find a way to combine everything so it all made sense somehow. Here's what Mike sent me. One side, front, back, or spine should be classical. One side should be modern. One side should be postmodern. At least one element must be 200 points or above, and at least one element must be 8 points or smaller. Kind of tricky, but I'm like, okay, I think I could go with this. Rebecca sent back this one, which was particularly terrifying. Use a felt tip pen to draw a picture of Paul's face, draw the picture in a single continuous line, do a blind contour drawing. Fair enough, but I can't really draw very well. So after dozens of attempts, I finally wound up with something that felt at least interesting, or at least interestingly bad. So anyway, time passes, I worked on it, and this is the final flat cover. After hours of sweat, I'm totally exaggerating, it wasn't that hard, I wound up with this. I love this more than anything I've made in the last few years. I'm also fascinated by the fact that what I love the most about it isn't really how it looks, but how it was made. I think it looks nice, but more than anything else, I'm thankful that I have friends I can work with and who are willing to feed me dumb instructions, and another friend who's willing to go along with our dumb ideas and let the whole thing exist in the world. I see this as a possibility, both as a way of working, but also as a way of thinking about work. The form is important, but it's not the most important. The work is the work, but not what it looks like. Okay, so the third and last one is the real superstore. This mega supermarket opened up in Baton Rouge in the early 1980s. Think like a supermarket that also has like a store that you can buy like regular stuff like home goods and groceries, like a mega Walmart or whatever. Their identity was built entirely around lots of huge Helvetica in black, white, and yellow. Compared to how things looked in Baton Rouge at the time, it felt like the future. They were owned by a company called National. This is their logo, more Helvetica. National was in turn owned by a Canadian chain called Loblaws. When I discovered this, it was amazing because I realized that they just flipped the logo upside down to the US market, which feels like totally brilliant to just reuse it. L becomes an N. Most amazingly, they had a generic brand called No Name. The packaging was all yellow with no pictures, just big, bold Helvetica. I've always been fascinated by how the store itself felt amazing, but the products felt cheap. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans the night before my first day of grad school. My family wasn't directly affected. They lost power at Baton Rouge. It was an ordeal. But seeing what might be my favorite city in the US be abandoned by our government was shocking. One lasting symbol of this for me are these emergency water cans distributed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. For someone in distress, this plain typography is a constant reminder of the lack of care given by the people who were supposed to help. Here's another version. So there's one in Helvetica and one in Futura Condensed. In a way, the design of these cans reminded me of John Carpenter's They Live, where Roddy Piper finds a pair of glasses that allow him to see the truth behind the media that surrounds us. Were these cans the essence of some cultural truth? I wondered, why does the minimal nature of these things feel bad? But at the same time, why can design that seems simple sometimes feel amazing? Here's another one of my favorite memes. It shows a water fountain with two labels. One is minimal and the other isn't. If you've had one of my classes, I've probably subjected you to it at some point. Here's another version, generic water is aesthetic water. And then did anyone else read the words in different voices in their head, or is that just me? I feel like this might sum up one of the main contradictions at the heart of design. How should meaning be conveyed through form? Is making things simple and straightforward the right way? Should we use visual cues to add extra reference and context? I love to ask students which one they think is best, and the answers are always interesting. These examples I've been showing are all works that we'd usually describe as minimal or possibly modernist in a class critique, but it doesn't really feel like they fit those categories. And they also make me think of what I think of as two of the most influential works of design in the last 10 years, namely Black Lives Matter signage and MAGA hats, Make America Great Again. Both are technically designed, but a lot of designers would consider them not quote unquote real design because they're too easy or maybe amateur. The MAGA hat is intentionally amateur. Its message means nothing, but its form expresses an attitude and a worldview that's almost immediately apparent. It doesn't care about how it looks. The typeface itself changes depending on whatever bold serif is available from whoever manufactures it. But the form itself is so potent that no matter what you change the wording to, the wearer will always look like a Trump supporter. In this sense, it's the ultimate example of form without content. Black Lives Matter signs are also formally simple, but yet they feel like the exact opposite. I first saw these in the early protests in Ferguson, Missouri after the police killing of Michael Brown. I was struck by how quickly they appeared at the start of the protests. It was clear that there was a serious grassroots organization making these happen. They were made with Arial, a ubiquitous default sans serif found on every computer in existence. It tends to be disliked by proper designers because of its attempt to copy Helvetica without being Helvetica. Something about the ubiquity of the typeface allows them to be read as just a message. They're printed on a laser printer. Just go to a friendly copy shop and all have a black background and are pasted on black poster board. Using this color inversion, protest posters are usually on white, allows for signs that are extremely readable in any news photograph, even at night. It's impossible to miss these messages. When we talk about work like this, we usually default to terms like minimalism or modernism. But these examples don't feel minimal, they're both loud, and certainly don't have any direct connection to a movement started in Europe in the early 20th century. Instead of thinking about the form, we should think about the purpose. What's being communicated and why? Now, this is a dumb quote. It's by Bob Gill, but I think it gets to one aspect of the basic idea here. Interesting words need boring graphics. Boring words need interesting graphics. But perhaps something a little bit more interesting would be this image by the designer Harsh Patel, where he juxtaposes these two great quotes, one by the writer Audre Lorde and another truism by Jenny Holzer. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Use what is dominant in a culture to change it quickly. I feel like these, I believe the Black Lives Matter signs fall somewhere in the infrathrin between these two. So ultimately, I think we need new words to talk about design. I'm not even sure if design is the right word anymore. We need new words to describe this thing of ours. Old terminology like modernism and minimalism only work when we consider form as the ultimate result of our work. Using outdated language like this connects these ideas to specific movements in specific times that might not necessarily apply. Because at the end of the day, design is really about what's communicated. The design part is just a means to an end. And this is the end. Thanks, y'all. It's been great. This, by the way, is what the real Superstore looks like now. It's just a store.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
All right.
For those of you that want to ask questions, you're free to just shout out your question, or if you want to type it into the chat, we'll be taking a look at it. While we wait, since you opened up this can of worms, Andrew,
Happy Friday, by the way.
Happy Friday. Sort of seeing the trajectory of this from the very first image with the Art Center Collective to this last image about sort of the modern movements, and also the last graphic with the Superstore with just the Helvetica on the outside. How would you define American graphic design? Because it seems like you're always, like, just looking at the presentation, it seems like you're very much working with this vernacular that's being found, you know, in the United States. And so I'm just curious how you see American graphic design.
I guess,
or even if that's the right way to frame it. So.
Okay, yeah, that's a big question. I think in general, I guess the easy answer would be that American graphic design tends to always see itself through the lens of like capitalism. So everything happens through business. And one of the things that I've been fascinated increasingly more as I do more teaching is how design can exist as a sort of like shared language. And so you can make something that's designed that isn't for like a client per se, but is more about like two people or two groups of people trying to get some kind of idea between each other, right? And so, you know, I guess the idea about American design, and I guess the way that we normally think of American design is almost entirely through like business and stuff. I think that's a really simple answer, though. It's kind of short, so I don't know if that works, but.
No, I mean, I think that would be a fair way of characterizing it. I guess then, like that second part that you mentioned about sort of looking at design, then, I mean, would you advocate then the way that you practice we have Photoshop and then the convolution, would you advocate that as a model for how designers should work together? I mean, I'm just thinking about this in context of our students here.
Yeah, no, totally. You know? I would say no. Only because I think that the stuff that we do, that we have Photoshop stuff and the convolution stuff, is not stuff that like generates like income. Like I don't support myself on it by that. So realistically speaking, there has to be like other stuff to make that happen. However, I think like when we founded We Have Photoshop, like every sort of decision we made as a group was always one that would like end up with us all still being friends and being able to do stuff together. And so in that sense, it's like, you know, when we do get a chance to work together, it feels like it's really good. It's like healthy. It's like, you know, kind of thing that I find like, you know, nourishing in a certain way. Nourishing is a really weird word. But so in that sense, like I find it to be like this really positive part of my life, right? And so I think ultimately, I think it's nice to find other ways beyond just doing what makes money. There's stuff that I could have shown in here that I do that like I think is like totally fine, but I do specifically like, okay, this will get like X amount of money. And it didn't really fit in what I'm talking about. So I'm not advocating against that. I'm not saying everybody needs to like go and like live off in like a cabin and just make like weird magazines that look funny. But I think it's really interesting to find ways to like, it's fine. It's nice to find ways to like work with people that feel healthy. I think that's it ultimately for me. It's nice.
So if I were to ask that in reverse or push on you, then are you saying that your other work is not healthy, or? No,
I'm not, but it's a different thing. It's a totally different thing. You know, there are certain things where you make compromises and you're like, okay, this is like a way to do it. There are other ways to do, there are things that don't. I think like, I don't think there's one approach that works right for everybody. I want to make clear that I'm not trying, again, I'm not trying to advocate like doing crazy stuff as the only way, but I think that, I guess it works for me. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, forgive me.
I think you got a great point.
To push you. I think this is a very interesting question, especially given some of our students, well, you know, a quarter of them are graduating, right? And so, you know, the issue about, you know, what do designers do in the world? How do you practice? You know, how does, well, capitalism and making money, earning a wage, but also, you know, practicing creativity and having a viewpoint, how do those things fit together? And it's interesting to hear you kind of articulate that, but then also putting that against the backdrop of how you've defined American graphic design as being defined against capitalism, and sort of putting all those ducks in a row. There's some, it's kind of funny. Not that the response is
Totally
funny, but
funny. Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
it's actually.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's totally funny. I think that it can be really, what am I trying to say here? I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Well, it'd be nice to follow on, I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah.
Yes.
On what Casper is saying too, of just, I find it super interesting that, you know, we've managed to make the words like community or team or any of these things now have been completely co-opted by companies, you know, so it's like your corporate community, it's your corporate team, you know, and even when people talk about coming together and making something, like it's still under that envelope mostly. And I find it interesting that all of your examples involve working together outside of that. One as a, you know, I guess like a nonprofit sort of space of like, how do you bring even teams of teams together? One of, you know, your own group, and then these movements, you know, that are, you know, they're not designers, but they're also like outside of a corporate framework, and it's interesting to me, because whenever I get frustrated, I just want to go be the Unabomber somewhere in a cabin. and so I'm always fascinated by people who are able to articulate and hold on to like, well, maybe actually we can do some things together that could give back to us. And I find that super heartening.
Yeah, I agree that it is heartening, but I think it also is critical depending on who's actually hearing the words that someone like you, Andrew, or someone like you, Juliet, are saying, and Casper as well, because the bifurcation between art and design, I think, is at the foundation of a lot of the, I don't know, sort of differences that are shaping or have shaped parts of your presentation as well. And so, I don't know, even to say something like, you know, when you spoke of Jeff, it felt like it was an admiration, but you still described him as one of the most uncompromising designers, you know, in existence. And when a student hears that, or when I hear that, then is that something that I should aspire to or to encourage? Because in some ways, like, Jeff is a particular person, and not many people beside him would be able to make the kinds of moves that he's been able to make, you know, because they just don't have the skills that he has. So
yeah,
something like that. I don't know what I'm saying, but I think it's it's a delicate balance, sort of trying to navigate between the different kinds of worlds that you describe, and what students leaving the program are going to be faced with, you know, quite soon.
Well, I think the interesting way to look at it would be not to look at like the type of work that Jeff makes per se, which I really love, but to like look at the way that somebody like Jeff or like any other designer, like how they make the work and like how it gets made and how they're able to do that, and see that kind of part behind the model. And goes to get into the idea of like not thinking about the end result, but thinking about like whatever, you know, there's always like, you know, some designer that lives in like a country that has more funding, or like some designers that have like, I don't know, a bunch of like family wealth or something, or some designers that have like a really great car. I don't know what, that helps things out. And so things are always different. And I think that the biggest advice I would say for students is like, anytime you see anybody that does interesting work, see if you can figure out how they support themselves. Like just kind of like dig around and see if you can figure out, does the work that they're showing, like, does that like pay their bills? Does that put a roof on their head? Or is there something else happening? You know, some people like teach a bunch and do a lot of lectures. Some people like just like subsist on like peanut butter all day long. Some people, you know, have some other like, you know, fantastic like whatever source or whatever. But and then some people are just able to like make it work. Like some people like kind of are able to do like lots of like really big stuff and like be able to do like the corporate stuff and make it like really amazing at the same time. And so I think there's not one really real direction, you know, but I guess my main point is just like look behind it, like try to see like how the stuff gets made and not stress over what it is.
Do you think that being able to make that kind of analysis comes with maturity and experience? Because I think a lot of times in class, I know I say I'm not so concerned about where you end up with the end product. Like I don't care what it looks like. I'm more interested in the discussions and the process and
totally
the kinds of things that you experience along the way.
Yeah.
And that advice doesn't play well in when you're a junior or a senior, you know? So I don't know how to make it more graspable or more open to being integrated to their processes at the moment.
It's something that like I feel like it's something that you just kind of have to like, you know, let it sit with you for like most of your life, you know. I don't feel like it's something that comes easily. And I think part of it is just the way that we tend to like consume design too. And so it's really easy to see, especially now where like you're just like scrolling through stuff endlessly and you just see image and image and image. I can always like, there's always like, you know, an example of a student that's like, oh, I worked so hard on this. Why isn't it good? Or like, I don't like this because I didn't spend a lot of time on it. And sometimes like the two things like don't correlate at all. So yeah, I think you know, I think it does require a certain amount of maturity, but I think sometimes the maturity can come from like looking into it too.
Well, we do have a question from the audience, from Jillian. Hi, Andrew. How do you manage to work with your friends while also maintaining a professional relationship? Is it easier to come to a consensus on design decisions when you work with people you knew beforehand? I think this is a very interesting question.
There were like a couple of like horrible disasters that we had early on where we would do a project, like we got like some like book commission and we're like, okay, 3 of us are going to work on the book at the same time, which is just like a terrible idea. There needs to be some kind of like established hierarchy or something like that, because like we would just all like sit in meetings and just come up with ideas and everybody would, you know, like have a great time and nothing would happen. The best stuff happens when like one person is kind of guiding it. I think we've gotten to a point for the most part where like we're not always working together all the time. We're not always like, you know, discussing stuff at the same time. When we do, we kind of have an understanding. The other issue is that we like started doing it in the first place because we found like when we met, we were all on the same page. And that's one thing that I'm really thankful for, and something that like isn't always reproducible. Like we just kind of like all got along and kind of like thought on the same wavelength. So on a lot of things, like we look at something and we generally like it in a similar way, although we do have disagreements. But I guess like also talking about what Alan said, like I would say that it's a fairly inefficient way of doing things, and does require a certain amount of like, you know, like planning beforehand. So like if something pops up and we want to do it, we're going to decide like, okay, the 2 of us, like, you know, 2 of us are working on it. And we might ask the other people for advice occasionally, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, how does that then relate to, I mean, I'm just thinking back to your presentation when you're talking about Helen and the way that she kind of collectively got together these organizations. I mean, how do you think that kind of lesson, like what kind of lessons can we learn from that, I guess, working today? Because it seems a lot more difficult in some ways to work collaboratively, even though technology has made it easier, but also right now, especially in today's kind of cultural climate, collaborating and working together, I think are, you know, those are some of the themes that
I think the thing that I've taken from it, there's like all kinds of other stuff that I could have added. I didn't want to like spend all day long with y'all. But the thing that I've taken from like doing that research on Helen, which is something I've been doing for like a number of years, it like haunts me in my sleep, But the thing that I've kind of taken away from it is like that kind of like creating that kind of change, like causing like groups and stuff to work together, like getting that kind of thing happen, like takes work and it takes effort and you have to really work at it. Like getting a group of 4 people to still like not hate each other after like working on a book and it being like this huge deal, like it takes effort. Like you have to work on the relationships, you have to communicate with people, all of that stuff. And doing it on like a big picture where you're like getting large groups to come together seems almost like unimaginable to me, you know? And so I think ultimately like it takes effort. Like you have to work at like getting people together, you have to work at staying together.
I'd like to ask a question primarily for Nico and Andrew and Juliet. You sort of triangulate, you know, with the thing, because Nico, your project that you did in Juliet's section had more to do with the content and structure rather than aestheticizing formal, you know, making formal moves. So was that your inclination or was that sort of Juliet's inclination?
I mean, my inclination, although I think the original suggestion to design the same text in different ways, that came from Juliet, and then I chose the text. And she kept pushing me to do something crazier and crazier and crazier. And that is something that like she had to push me to do that to get to the nonsense one, because my inclination is to make things that I think are useful or that I would find useful. So I appreciate her pushing me to sort of really do something more in the vein of experimental. But yeah, no, I mean, that's my natural interest to sort of work with the structure. I'd say I actually didn't work as much with the content. So it's not aestheticization in the way some other more conventional design is, but it's also not really about the content. It was more about really the structure of the text, the system.
Okay, so then in that light, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, like, there's 2 things that I think, or 2 things that I felt I recognized in Nico that I have as well. One is a love of reading, which actually Andrew and I also share as well. And you know, there's a lot spoken about graphic design being a form of writing, but not very often is graphic design actually explained as a form of reading and like showing how you read and what you read. And so in his work, I could see that, which I think is really cool. I love it when I see that. And then the second is just like the desire to do things right, you know, which I think is, you know, shared amongst many of us. And I particularly admire people who are able to transcend that, using whatever tricks there are in the box, because the urge to like get the check mark and like do the thing correctly can overwhelm and overcome all other considerations. And if you do that like 400 times, like you don't feel that good. And I, you know, so I think given that, you know, there was no need to work on a series of other skills, like just working on overcoming that urge seemed like a good time to just work on that. I'm still working on it for myself. So, and Andrew has watched me work, so he knows exactly what I'm talking about.
And I guess I would follow that up with like, so Nico and Andrew's class now is like, and Andrew, you spoke of the flip-flopping between image and text and image being one for the other. Like, I'm sure Nico is one of those students that you're happy to have, you know, once every 5-10 years kind of thing. So how do you make the most of that opportunity? Like, he obviously has the skills to do more. Why are you guys laughing? What is the joke?
Nothing. You give him a big head here.
Good.
It's
I mean,
good.
you build them up and then you cut them down, you know?
Watch out for next week.
Well, actually, I did want to ask about.
You should take Alan next.
I did want to ask actually, Nico, towards the end of your presentation, you had showed several variations of your project where you actually structured the content in different ways. But I was actually thinking about at the very end, you say the one that you would use the most as a philosophy student or in your everyday life would be the very first one, which is probably the least designed and least meddled with, even though the other explorations were actually fairly interesting. Have you ever thought about what what implications of that has for designers? Because oftentimes we try to find very fanciful solutions for things, but then at the very end, even you yourself as a designer, you've kind of come back to the most default solution. I mean, I don't know if you've had any thoughts about that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, another thing that Julia and I talked about a lot was just, I mean, digital formats like across the board. Like another thing is I would prefer to read it in print, and I don't know what translating that particular format would look like in print. But I mean, it's just a really fine line to walk, because I don't know, I am really interested in how the visual structure of content can really like fundamentally change the way that you experience that information and understand that information. And at the same time, I think that a lot of the time, the work that we do just sort of gets in the way of that. I mean, there's just, I mean, that's just glass. What is it? Glass. Beatrice Ward. I'm missing the name.
Crystal Goblet.
The goblet. Yeah.
Crystal Goblet, not glass goblet. Yeah, I think it's just a fine line to cross, or a fine line to walk.
Well, linking that with, I guess, Andrew, in your examples, right, of all the types of design that you showed in your presentation, many of them were actually non-designed, or just as you mentioned, not designed. So I guess would you have an answer to your own question about what you would call design, since you crossed out that word?
I think it's still design, but I think that like what we do, it's so nebulous. Like I like looking at the history. There was a moment before there was like a single field, and there was just like lots of people who did different stuff. Like you were a printer, or you did fine printing, or you did prints, or you did photography or whatever. And you might be like a photographer that was like a member of the AIGA or something, but it wasn't like there wasn't like a unified umbrella. And then like around like basically like some point in the mid-20s it changed, and we got the term graphic design, and it slowly like took over, and that's been the thing for like 100 years or so. And like now I feel like we're back in a situation where things are a lot more fragmented. You have a lot of people that will do like one specific type of digital thing or one specific type of motion, and they don't really intersect in the same way. And the language, there is a universal language, but it's not like the same thing that you get from one place always. And so I guess I guess it's more that it's not that I don't think that we should say design, but I feel kind of uncomfortable calling it design. It also feels like it's almost like a borrowed word, like it comes from somewhere else and like isn't necessarily the thing that we do, like there is an active design, but it's almost like it's almost like this aspirational idea, like when Dwiggins was talking about graphic design, he was talking about what he did with like doing like, patterns and images and photographs and stuff, and like likening it to like what somebody would have done making like patterns for like textiles and stuff. And so taking this one thing that was established and bigger and applying it to what he did. And so like, I wish there was like, I kept trying to think of like a better word, and like, I don't know if someone else has to think of it, but I feel like there needs to be a new word. And so I just took the term that the mafia uses, this thing of ours. I feel like that's better.
May I add something to that? I mean, just to connect it back to Wittgenstein for a second. I mean, he's one of my favorite philosophers as well. No, but okay. One of the ideas that he's most famous for is this idea of family resemblance. And he's a philosopher of language, which I didn't talk about a lot. But so one of the ideas he's most famous for is that philosophers, one of the assumptions they make is that when you call something a table, it's because among all tables in existence, there is some fundamental thing that is central to all tables. And Wittgenstein was like, you're stupid. There's nothing that like, there's no fundamental essence of tables. And I think it's the same way with design as a field. I mean, I really liked Andrew's presentation because it really brings out this way in which we tend to treat this as a single topic and get confused because we use the same word for multiple different things, but there's no one thing we call design. There's a lot of different things that have resemblances between them. And so there's a sort of cluster of fields that we call design and try to treat together.
That was pretty brilliant.
Stop, Alan. No, I mean, I do want to say too that just to follow on that, you know, I have spent a lot of time problematizing that, like, oh, you know, we should really land on a definition and like, you know, let's get on it. And, you know, I've made an effort to make a definition and all this stuff. And in the last couple of years, I'm actually finding that the lack of definition is like the benefit, you know, like the fact that it's so squishy. At this point, I no longer want it to be less so, because there's a freedom in that, you know, and I say this to students all the time, like, you know, if you're going to be a dental hygienist, you know exactly what you're going to do and where you're going to do it, like until you are no longer a dental hygienist. Like there's no other thing, right? And then in design, you can do one of a billion different things and call it design and say, I'm a designer and therefore I'm doing X, and like no one will question it. And so you get to not just have like a career, like so to speak, but you can actually do 10 different things by the time you're done. And then just say like, oh, I was a designer, like all the way across, you know, which I don't think there's another field that's like that. Like I really don't. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's such a mess, you know, like that there's no definition. But, you know, within that lack of definition means like, I can stop doing this right now and like go and do something completely different, and still my identity would still be designer somehow.
I don't know how our students think about that. Is that terrifying or completely liberating? I'm not quite sure.
I mean, the whole point is to do whatever you want, right? I mean,
Yeah.
right?
And I think if students sort of like look to the examples that I think we bring into the classroom every day, like none of us, I think, are confined or confine ourselves to, you know, one aspect of the practice. By definition, it's undefined and ever changing.
Or even an attitude, like you can be that designer who's like super zero focused on their stuff, right? And then you can say, screw this, I'm gonna like go and like be part of this gigantic team of people and like do this gigantic thing, and then get tired of that and go back to, you know, like, which I think is it. I mean, for me, it's liberating, because I always feel like whatever I'm doing, it must be the wrong thing. So, yeah.
Our audience says it's comforting, so that's good.
Casper, have you noticed, like, is there a concerted effort to sort of borrow or involve other practices? Like, you know, Nico's bringing in philosophy, and I know there's this aspect of the discipline being historicized enough that it becomes something in and of itself, right? So I think the insularity of designers sort of is like cutting ourselves at the knees, because we sort of self-define and keep the borders, you know, for whatever perimeter we feel comfortable, the outside at bay. And I don't know, like the more I work with other people from other disciplines, the better the condition that I find myself in becomes, you know. And I don't know how to do that beyond.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll read the response from our audience, because I think this is a very good response to that, and it's also, we're also at 4, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But Daniel says design is a multidimensional catalyst for change in identity, which I think is a very good sort of summation of this. So I would definitely go with that definition too. So thank you, Daniel, for offering that. I do want to thank everybody here in the audience for joining us today, and also especially both Andrew and Nico for sharing their work with us. Thank you so much, and we'll see everybody at our next CD lecture. So thank you, everybody. Take care now.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Nico.